So Julian and I are going to be talking about elective deliveries and child development. Oops, why is it not working? Okay, this is part of a broader project that's at 3 different sites, and we have representation here from all 3 sites. So Julian and Valentina are here from Columbia, and Ka Lu is here from UCLA. Hi, Ka. Okay, so rates of cesarean section and induced deliveries have risen substantially in the United States over recent decades. C-sections increased by over 40%, and inductions increased by over 150% between 1990 and 2015, and that's a period of only 25 years. C-sections currently account for over 1/3 of all US births, and around 1/4 of all US births are induced. And these are not mutually exclusive. Inductions can fail and result in C-section deliveries. There's little indication that increases in risk factors such as maternal age, obesity, and medical conditions explain these increases. And rates of C-sections and inductions vary little by maternal race, ethnicity, education, and marital status. The rates have stabilized since 2006, but they remain at peak levels. And this has been going on for a while. Only 5% of births were delivered by cesarean section in 1970. The figure more than tripled to 17% in 1980, and then it subsequently doubled. There exists no long-term trend data on inductions in the United States. This is all we know. But before we get appalled by this, it's important to realize that infant mortality more than halved between 1980 and 2000, and that fetal mortality also declined during much of this period. And C-sections, no doubt, contributed to some of those improvements. That said, neither infant nor fetal mortality declined between 2000 and 2006, while C-sections shot up. And maternal mortality did not decline over the recent 2 to 3 decade period. Okay, at the same time, reported rates of child disability have been skyrocketing. And this is trends in limitations in activities due to chronic conditions, which according to experts is the best measure of overall measure of child disability in the United States for which trends can be produced. We don't have great data like in Scandinavian countries. This is from a Future of Children volume on child disability. And at the pre-publication conference, we spent the good part of 2 days staring at this remarkable graph and trying to figure out how much was real, and if it was real, how much was driving it. And 2 things that came out of the conferences were that at least some of it, a substantial part is real. It's not an artifact of things like increased diagnoses, and that it's largely driven by increases in cognitive and behavioral disorders, which now represent the dominant sources of child disability in the United States. And the blue box just corresponds to the time period for the initial graph I showed you for the trends in C-sections and inductions. Okay, the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in particular has increased substantially. These are trend data from what are considered the best sources of trend data on autism spectrum disorder in the US. The black and orange are from monitoring networks, and the pink is from California data that we actually used in one of the pieces of the research that we're going to present today. And the California rates are lower because it only includes classic autism. It doesn't include anything else on the spectrum like Asperger's. And there's just 2 other things I wanted to say related to this. Ka, our collaborator, and Peter Behrman, our other collaborator, and others found that these increases are only partially attributable to changes in diagnostic criteria, diagnostic substitution, and earlier age of diagnosis. And the other final thing I want to say about this slide is a genetic origin for autism has long been suspected, but only 10 to 20% of autism cases have well-defined genetic causes. So it leaves us a lot to explain. Okay, so could these trends be related? Increasing C-sections and inductions, increasing child disability, and in particular autism. Well, there are studies showing that C-sections are associated with impairments in children's sensory perception, sensory integration, neuropsychiatric development, and autism. But C-sections are often performed for medical reasons. And the studies showing links between C-sections and these developmental impairments have not done a good job, to say the least, of accounting for medical risk. So it's not known whether C-sections cause impairments. And in particular, it's not known whether elective, non-medically necessary interventions, C-sections, impair children's development. Now, there are plausible pathways other than selection. And I'll talk about pathways more, but just to name a couple, these interventions can have direct effects on children's development. One it could operate through gestational age. These interventions, by definition, shorten gestational age just a little bit. And every week of gestational age has shown to matter, even among full-term births. And another plausible pathway is through neonatal morbidities that have associations with longer-term developmental impairments. And I will talk about the pathways more. So today, we're going to be talking about three things: elective deliveries and neonatal morbidities. And by elective deliveries, we are referring to non-medically necessary C-sections and inductions. We're going to talk about elective deliveries and autism. And then Julian's going to talk about factors potentially driving the increases in elective deliveries, because there have been increases in elective deliveries. Obviously, there have been if you look at those overall graphs. Okay, so we need to address these three topics, we need to define elective deliveries. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview of kind of what we did with the data that we have, and I'll get into more specifics when we talk about the specific pieces. But basically in this project, we used linked statewide data from two states, New Jersey and California, over several decades. And I'll tell you about years and sample sizes and stuff. And so what we had were birth records for all births in these states. We had that were linked to maternal and infant hospital discharge records, and we had those for both states. And for California, we had developmental disability data that Ka and Peter have used in a lot of previous research. And it's the pink data that we saw in the autism graph. And I'll tell you a little more shortly. Okay, so what our strategy was to define low risk cases, really low risk cases, cases where there should not be any interventions, where there are no risk factors, and these cesareans and inductions should not happen. So we really had three criteria. The first criteria was that we limited the sample to first births in both states. We were only focusing on first births because we all know that once somebody has a C-section, the likelihood that they have a C-section for subsequent pregnancies is very, very high, making first births a really important focus. And we focused on full-term births. Generally, OBs do not want to intervene with preterm infants. Full-term is technically 37 to 41 completed weeks of gestational age. We are focusing on 37 to 40 because, to be conservative, because gestational age, even though we have really good measures, it's not accurate to the day. And once you start getting into 41 weeks, you're getting very close to 42 weeks, where induction is often recommended because it's a post-term birth. Okay, and the third piece of this is that we, in our low risk sample, we excluded all mothers who had ICD-9 codes or diagnoses in their hospital discharge record from the birth hospitalization that were on two lists. And I'll tell you what the two lists were in a minute, but what's the Joint Commission? Okay, the Joint Commission, for those who don't know, is the organization in the US that currently accredits hospitals and to monitor perinatal outcomes, and they monitor all kinds of outcomes. They convened a panel of experts in about 2014 to identify specific outcomes, perinatal outcomes to monitor, and how they were going to monitor them. You know, what are they going to measure? So as part of that, they identified lists of conditions possibly justifying elective delivery prior to 39 weeks gestation. And they also identified contraindications to vaginal delivery. So we constructed our low risk samples that we use for all of our analyses by excluding mothers with any of those conditions. And I have the lists I can show anybody who's interested. And so so if we define low risk cases correctly, any interventions with, for those births, would be elective. And by interventions, what we're interested in are induced vaginal deliveries, C-sections that did not follow induction, so they're essentially planned, and C-sections following inductions. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is elective deliveries and neonatal outcomes, and this uses the New Jersey data. And we use birth records from 1997 to 2011. There were about 1.5 million births in New Jersey during this period, and about a couple 100,000 are in our low risk sample. So we're using our low risk sample. It's the mother's birth records linked to their hospital discharge records. And we estimated associations between delivery methods and salient neonatal morbidities and outcomes in low risk pregnancies. Now, what are salient neonatal morbidities? The two that we focused on were respiratory conditions, which is a bunch of different kinds of conditions. And it's the main reason that infants are in neonatal care units. And we focused on hyperbilirubinemia, which is jaundice. And we focused on those conditions for two reasons. Number one, because they're not particularly rare. So they might explain some of what we want to explain. And the other reason is that they're both associated with cognitive and developmental impairments down the road, even among full-term infants. And the other two neonatal outcomes we looked at were more general, like proxies for neonatal morbidity, not really proxies, but just general measures. One was the infant in the NICU, and did the infant stay in the hospital for more than 5 days in their newborn hospitalization? And the good thing about NICU is it captures, like, there's a zillion rare conditions that there's not enough of them to look at. But so if you're in the NICU, you're sick, it's in there. So we can see here, these are adjusted associations between these delivery methods. And we always compare to spontaneous vaginal birth and each of the 4 neonatal outcomes. And we're presenting odds ratios and indicators for statistical significance with the stars. And every time you see a star, it's very, very, very significant because we have so many observations. So none of the delivery methods are associated with jaundice, so that's easy. And vaginal induced births, the orange bar, have small associations.
Nancy, could you just use your mouse to point to what you're talking about?
Oh yeah, okay, sure. Okay, so jaundice, there's nothing, okay? Vaginal induced births, the orange bars, have small associations with the other 3 outcomes. They're significant and small, relative. And C-sections are strongly associated with all 3 conditions other than jaundice, particularly those that follow inductions, okay? And you can see here what we controlled for at the bottom in the notes. And I can tell you that these things were very robust no matter what we controlled for. These effects, these associations persisted in our low risk sample in New Jersey. Okay, so the summary of this piece is that elective deliveries are strongly and robustly associated with adverse neonatal outcomes. C-sections doubled the odds of respiratory conditions, and NICU stays also increased the and C-sections also doubled the odds of NICU stays, and also increased the odds of long newborn stays. And there were adverse associations between induced vaginal deliveries and neonatal outcomes, except for jaundice, but they were much smaller than for C-sections. And I didn't show you data that to look at, but over half of the inductions in our low risk sample were followed by C-sections. So inductions in those cases led to compromised neonatal outcomes. So unless you know that an induction is going to work in advance, they're not, they are associated with adverse neonatal outcomes. And this work is actually published, and there's a citation. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about today, the last piece, is elective deliveries and autism. And so we did a population-based cohort study using the California data. And it was birth records for many, many years. There were about 10.8 million births that we looked at. And those birth records were linked to maternal hospital discharge records and infant hospital discharge records and the California Developmental Disability, Department of Developmental Services data going through 2018. So it's very recent, you know, it's a trend. We have good data for many years up to the recent past. The California data are considered the most reliable data on long-term trends in autism in the United States. And again, we limited the sample to low-risk births using the Joint Commission algorithm that I showed you before. And we used logistic regression to adjust for time trends and other potentially confounding factors. So the punchline is in the title of this talk, but I'll walk you through it. So the outcomes to autism diagnosis. And each row is a separate model that you can see visually, or you can see the odds ratios over on the right. And in the top, we show estimates for all births, a couple different models. And in the bottom, we show estimates using our low risk sample, among which we think that we'll try to convince you that any intervention is an elective one. And and the last row shows an even stricter low risk sample that further excludes, beyond everybody else we excluded, it further excluded births with diagnoses of, where the mothers had diagnoses of depression, addiction, or infection. But the results are very robust, and I'm gonna focus on the on this model that's outlined in red because we think it's pretty, it's a good example of our results. It's very representative. So what we adjusted for all the covariates that are on the bottom, but again, I can tell you, Kalu ran these models, and she's even more compulsive than I am. And we ran it every which way. She adjusted for her hospital at birth, she adjusted for zip code, she adjusted for everything under the sun. She looked at every possible sample. She's amazing. So the bottom line is that vaginal induced births are associated with 7% increased odds of having an autism diagnosis, and having a C-section with that does not follow an induction. A planned C-section is associated with a 26% higher odds of having an autism diagnosis. And finally, having a C-section after induction, that group always does worse. It's associated with a 31% higher odds of having an autism diagnosis. So, and we talk about risk of autism here because, as you know, odds ratios closely approximate risk ratios when the outcome is rare, like autism. So this figure shows estimates of the contribution of elective deliveries to autism cases for cohorts born in California between 1992 and 2012. In the early period, where's my mouse? Here. In the early period, when rates of elective deliveries were relatively low, elective deliveries did not account for any autism cases. But as rates of elective deliveries went up over time, the fraction of cases that they accounted for increased to somewhere in the range of 5 to 10%. And note that this figure shows population attributable fractions only among the low risk sample. not the entire population of births in California. But this is the population we're most interested in, as interventions are discretionary in this population. So autism spectrum disorder cases could potentially be prevented. So a summary of this piece, we found strong and robust associations between C-sections and autism in low-risk pregnancies. There were small associations between induced vaginal deliveries and autism in low-risk pregnancies. And up to 10% of autism cases among low-risk births could be preventable by avoiding medically unnecessary obstetric interventions. And we wanted to point out that that 5 to 10% is larger than the percentages that have been attributed in the literature to other risk factors for autism, such as parental age, environmental toxins, prenatal infections, and prenatal medications. And further research is definitely needed to elucidate the mechanisms, but the implications are obvious. Don't do these interventions. So this is my last slide before questions or Julian takes over. So how would C-sections affect autism? And there's a bunch of pathways in the literature, and we were able to rule out 2 with our data. And we can't test the others with the kind of data that we're using, the big data, the big administrative linked data. So the most obvious one is that delivery interventions reduce gestational age. We didn't find any evidence that was an operative pathway between C-sections and autism. The second potential pathway that we were able to rule out is that going through the birth canal stimulates the infant's lungs, reducing the likelihood of neonatal respiratory conditions, which we showed you it did, right, in our first paper. But that, again, was not an operative pathway between the interventions and autism. So the other ones that we can't explore are simply that going through the birth canal increases brain arousal. I was reading about this, that it could have some long-term effect. Infants delivered by C-sections without labor are not exposed to the mother's microbiome, whatever, those terms are used interchangeably, which research suggests, increasingly suggests plays a role in brain development. C-sections can be performed under, oh, and by the way, the microbiome one, I sit at Rutgers in the Child Health Institute, and most of my colleagues there have labs with mice, and they're totally sold on that explanation. They said, that's it, they're into genetics, and they said, that's the one. But I can't test it, and that's out of my area. The next potential explanation is that C-sections can be conducted under general anesthesia. They often are. So there's some evidence that early life exposure to anesthesia causes neurotoxic changes in the brain. Oxytocin, which is used for a lot of inductions, it's a medical inductions, may be associated with autism spectrum disorder. There's actually a whole literature on this, and they fight a lot about it, and it's really mixed, and everybody has strong opinions. So the jury's out on that one. And finally, infants born before labor naturally occurs may just be less developed and more vulnerable. So that's it. Julian's going to talk about what's going on, but if you'd like to have a little question break, that's fine.
We'd love a question break. Thank you, Nancy. That was terrific.
Thank you.
So maybe I'm pre-jumping into what Julian's going to talk about, but the strategy here is to try to take women for whom the C-section was somehow, or the induction was somehow not driven by their background characteristics. So what is driving it? I mean, the skeptic in us all says, oh, there's some unobservable that you're not controlling for. So what are you thinking? Is this just a random thing who your doctor is?
Well, this is exactly what Julian's going to talk about. What do I think it is? I think it's a combination of patients, providers, and I don't know what the operative mechanism is, but it's happening. But I'm going to let Julian handle that piece.
Well, there's no spoiler here because we don't know the answer yet. So I'm going to go through some slides, but we really don't know. But to your question, Josh, it's not clear at all that women are really trying to avoid either inductions or C-sections. There's really no clear evidence of a push that it's all driven by physicians. But again, the data we've looked at, that's part 2 of this project, and the data we've looked at so far suggests that it still suggests it could be either.
I haven't kept super good track of all the questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, just unmute. We'll pause for 5 seconds and just let someone speak. Okay, it's like teaching on Zoom. It's just hard. Yeah. Are you going to talk about sibling effects, or same woman, different births?
No.
No. Okay. So let's go on to that episode 2, and then we'll have a more serious discussion after we're done. Thank you.
Okay. Julie, I mean, sibling effects aren't a great test here because there's such a correlation between delivery methods across from going from a first birth to a second birth to a third birth. So it's not a clean experiment.
There are basically no there are no non-C-sections for higher order births if the first child was a C-section.
There's a couple, but it's
I mean, it's very rare, and yeah. So we've thought a lot about that, and we haven't found a way to leverage the mother fixed effects approaches.
Right. Just because we could do sibling models doesn't mean it's appropriate for this question.
Okay. After that interlude, Julian, take it away.
Okay. Let's see if this works. You guys see my my slide? Should look the same as Nancy's did.
Yes.
Okay, so well, what's going on? So we're pretty convinced that elective deliveries confer risks to infant and child health. The question we're interested in is what's driving these practices, as Josh has been asking about. There have been a number of explanations. On the provider side, there was speculation that physicians were pushing these practices for insurance purposes or fears of malpractice suits. That's pretty much been dispelled by some of the work that Janet Curry and others have done. It's also possible that hospital administrators prefer scheduled deliveries to regulate the flow of births, which minimizes staffing and hospital room and maximizes hospital room efficiencies. Physicians might prefer them so they can work regular day shifts. It's also possible that some medical schools and residencies are training physicians to recommend inductions and C-sections. On the demand side, it's possible that some women want to be more in control of the birth process. Maybe they're fearful of labor and delivery. Maybe they have concerns about the effects of childbirth, about the effects childbirth will have on them physiologically. So we can't really test these hypotheses with the data that we have, but we can start to unpack what's been happening over time. And our hope is to get some insights into what's driving what we see as a real medicalization of deliveries. So the first easy thing we can do is look at who's getting elective deliveries. So this table shows the percent delivering by each type of method, by age, race, educational attainment, and a rough proxy for income, whether Medicaid paid for the birth. So first, there are large age differences. You can see 82% of teenage mothers delivered without an intervention. So vaginal not reduced is what is sort of delivering naturally as opposed to induction, C-section, and C-section following an induction. So 82% of teens deliver vaginally without an intervention compared to about 60% of older women. So, the converse is about 20% of teens deliver by elective delivery with one of these methods compared to twice that 40% among the older mothers. Rates of, and then if you look at C-sections not induced, these are the scheduled C-sections. The rate's even higher. It's an 8 to 1, or older women are 8 times more likely to deliver with that method. There are some gradients when you look at race, education, and Medicaid, all sort of in a consistent direction, showing that non-Hispanic whites are more likely to have an elective delivery. They're less likely to have to not have one. Same thing for college graduates, and same thing for the higher income population. Okay, so what should we make of these findings? I generally assume that increased levels of human capital allow one to exercise more control in the decision making. And since human capital is associated with higher rates of inductions and C-sections, it suggests to me that mother preferences are playing at least some role in the decision. It's also possible that doctors that have wealthy patients are pushing the elective deliveries on them. But our SES effects remain when we include hospital fixed effects, and they also remain when we include neighborhood fixed effects. So it's important to point out that the large increases in the rates of elective deliveries over the past 20 years have occurred pretty much equally across all groups. There isn't really an SES gradient in the rates of increase. SES gradients were present in the 90s, and they're still present to about the same extent now. Additionally, the SES gradient could just reflect maternal age associations. Risk-averse physicians might be pushing older mothers towards controlled deliveries, and older mothers tend to be wealthier and more educated. So there's still a lot more unpacking that we need to do here, some that we can do with these data by cross-classifying some of these categories. Can I move to the next slide? Okay. This figure shows trends in all elective deliveries. That's the blue line on top. Induced deliveries in orange. C-sections without a labor trial. These are the planned C-sections in gray. And in yellow at the bottom, what we often refer to as failed inductions. They start off as an induction, but they end up as a C-section. So the yellow, orange, and gray are mutually exclusive categories here, and they sum to the blue total line here. So there's a lot of information we can glean from these trends, but I want to point out just a couple of things for now. The first is that the general trend in elective deliveries is very similar in California and New Jersey. So California started at slightly or some substantially higher rates at the beginning of the period, but the two states sort of peaked at about the same time. They stabilized and they started declining a little bit around the same time as well. Just want to point out that the New Jersey figures, we have data through 2014, whereas in California it's 2012. So the drop off the last couple of years in New Jersey could be occurring in California too. We just haven't looked at data out that far.
Julian, just so I make sure I understand
Sure.
this figure, the y-axis is percent and the blue
Yes.
line is all interventions combined?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
This is percent and this is all elective deliveries, right? So the converse of this would be
All
non-elective.
non-elective deliveries.
Right.
Oh, so all elective deliveries, yeah.
Right, among this low risk sample. Okay, so the overall pattern is similar, but there are differences when you look at the specific types of interventions. Scheduled C-sections in the gray line are substantially higher in California than they are in New Jersey. And C-sections that the failed inductions and the scheduled inductions are somewhat higher in New Jersey than in California. That suggests that there's probably some local factors at play, but these local factors, of course, could be either on the physician or in a hospital network side, or they could be on the maternal social network side. The other observation I want to draw your attention to is that the rate of induction failures has been increasing. This is a little trickier to see, but you can see this when you look both at the yellow and the orange lines. At the start of the period, I'm going to focus on New Jersey here. It's a little more pronounced. At the start of the period, the failure rate, the ratio of failures to successes is about 1 to 4. In 1997, about 3% of deliveries were from inductions that failed, and about 12–13% were from inductions that succeeded, in a sense that resulted in a vaginal birth. By the end of the period, the ratio goes from 1 to 4 to 1 to 2. So that's, in terms of percentages, it's about 20% of the inductions fail at the beginning of the period, and about 40%, or rather 30% fail by the end of the period. Another way to look at it is among births that are delivered by cesarean, there are as many that start off as an induction, the yellow line, as there are that are originally planned as a C-section during this period. So it's the rate of failure is quite substantial. It's about a third right now, and just depending on how you look at it, it's been increasing quite substantially. Now, it's not difficult for me to believe that women would prefer to deliver by C-section or by induction than vaginally, to address your comment, Josh. But what's not really conceivable, or what's very difficult for me to imagine, is that women would choose to have both experiences for the same birth. That is, to experience labor and also a C-section. And I suspect that they're not all fully informed about what the likely outcome of that induction is when they're weighing their decisions. Another way to get at whether hospitals, physicians, or mothers are driving the increased rates of elective deliveries is to look at the diffusion patterns across hospital networks, physician networks, and residential proximity. We're not nearly as far along with this part of the project, but I wanted to illustrate where we're heading. So this slide shows maps of New Jersey in consecutive 3-year bands. The bottom row shows clusters of elective deliveries by women's residential addresses in each time period. The top one cumulatively overlays these maps to better illustrate the spatial diffusion over time. So this is the snapshot in 97 to 99, bottom left. This is a snapshot in 2012 to 2014. If you look at the top, the second map here overlays the snapshot from the second period with the snapshot of the first period. So by the end of the period, we see all of the maps overlaid. And what's we think is interesting here is that it looks like you start off with a couple clusters, and then these clusters sort of radiate outward. It's not sort of a random spatial process where these clusters are popping up left and right. Now, I'm sorry. Of course, clusters like this can exist for a number of reasons. They can be due to selection of individuals into neighborhoods, which isn't interesting to us. So we want to control those factors away, or they can arise because of shared medical or social environments. If we observe clusters after controlling for individual attributes, but the clusters disappear after we account for hospitals and physicians, then it suggests that hospital level factors are important. But if the clusters still remain, it suggests that women's decisions might be influenced by their social networks. So we've gotten as far as step 1, and it looks like spatial clusters remain after we control for the individual level attributes of mothers. So what we still get these clusters. We haven't really identified yet whether these are hospital clusters or hospital effects that are driving this, or hospital network effects that are spatially located, or whether it's social networks. So what have we learned so far? Well, first, that non-medically necessary C-section deliveries confer risks to children. Since an increasing proportion of inductions end up as C-sections, planned inductions also confer risks. They confer much less risk if they succeed, but again, we can't usually predict whether they're going to succeed or not. Higher SES women are slightly more likely to have elective deliveries than our lower SES women, but rates of elective deliveries have increased across all groups. And we found some evidence of clustering and spatial diffusion of elective deliveries, but we don't know yet whether it's driven by mothers, physician networks, or hospitals. And that's it. Thank you.
Super, that was great. We already have a couple of questions. Let me ask Aisha, can you speak into the mic and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Nancy and Julian. So my question is thinking a little bit about maybe a potential selection issue, particularly the sort of, Julian, the very last thing you sort of presented, the higher SES women having a slightly higher rate of elective delivery. So I was wondering if, because at least some of the trend in autism, we think may be a diagnosis issue over time, is it possible that women who are choosing these elective deliveries are also then more likely to seek out a diagnosis of autism for their kids?
Yes, so we spent quite a while thinking about that. Where did we end up? I mean,
I can chime in something.
Yeah.
These are severe cases of autism. I mean, it's a very severe condition. It's not just like a little impairment. And the state captures like all the cases. I forget. I mean, Khan knows those statistics on it. But this is a diagnosis that's hard to hide. So, I mean, I know we had other discussions about other aspects of that. We talked about it a lot, but just the medically oriented moms. But that's the thought that comes to my head. It's
so yeah, just to elaborate on what Nancy's saying. And Ka can jump in too, because she probably ran 30 models looking at this. But so we looked at this by severity of autism. The idea being that if there was a selection effect related to mothers seeking these diagnoses, we should see a stronger effect among less severe autism cases than among the ones that are much, much clearer. And we didn't see that at all. In fact, I think we found the opposite, that there's more effect among the more severe cases, but I'm not remembering exactly.
Yeah, Ka, feel free. You don't have to, but feel free to chime in.
Yes. So yeah, we tried to test that hypothesis, like mothers who seek C-section or inductions are more likely to get the kid diagnosed or see a doctor when something looks not all that all right. But the expectation would be, if that's the case, I would have expected a different relationship with intellectual disability. Like if it's high SES, high socioeconomic status moms seeking diagnosis and elective delivery, I would expect them to avoid a more stigmatizing diagnosis of basically mental retardation. So, but we didn't see that. We still see a positive association between elective delivery and intellectual disability, which gave me some confidence as it's not about selection of medicalized moms.
It's a great question, and we
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Will, you're asking kind of a technical question, but maybe is there a way in which it can be made less technical? Or I guess maybe it's not a good question. You're already getting a little answer in chat on types of fixed effects.
Yeah, I kind of answered the question, I think. So that the fixed specifications are still exploiting both within the hospital variation across mothers in any given hospital year, but also exploiting the variation over time within a hospital or provider. And I think that if we really want to exploit the quasi-experimental variation of the increase of the changes over time in a provider's behavior or hospital behavior, you were talking, Julian, about the diffusion and looking at nearby folks, but I'm just even ignoring the spatial aspect of this. I think just collapsing the data to the physician year level and re-estimating the models would really allow you to focus in on that quasi-experimental variation, which I think would give you stronger causal inferences. So, Ka, is that what you were referring to that you've already done?
You're muted.
You're muted. Yeah.
We just started doing that, but the one part of the project is to look at the diffusion of elective delivery at the physician level, at the attending physician level. So we have looked at like the rates of elective delivery among one's colleagues. Would it get diffused to a physician's rates in the future, like that kind of framework. So the great thing about the New Jersey data is we know we have the ID of the physicians, so we can make use of the heterogeneity and the time trend.
We were also talking at some point about looking at where physicians got trained as well, and seeing whether there was clustering on the residencies and medical schools. So that, again, that's really the last part of the project, and I just gave you sort of a flavor of where we were headed, but unfortunately, you'll have to re-invite us next year with real answers to those questions.
Great. I had a question about insurance and money. So if there are no ICD-9 codes and things like that, how is the reimbursement happening?
There are always ICD-9 codes.
So the point is there's the codes that you listed are the ones you eliminated. And so
Yeah.
what are the codes? The codes being used indicate,
So,
this is
Josh,
elective, this is because somebody
asking,
felt like it?
You're asking all the questions that I was asking over the last few years. So no, that's not a demonstration of them being great questions, but it just means that we've looked at that. And
no, they're great questions.
Yeah. So I was wondering that too. Like, what you have to list something to get reimbursed, and so we took random samples of these cases and looked at them, and they are what we think of as these like squishy categories of pelvis, small pelvis.
Right. Disproportion between pelvis and the size of the baby. It's not on the Joint Commission list. They don't say that's bad.
And the rates of increase in the use of those diagnoses is mirroring the rates in the increase of these procedures. It's not really plausible to us that, well, first of all, they're not considered anything, they're not considered a serious condition.
Well, they're subjective too.
They're subjective. And it's not really plausible that there is such a specific medical condition that's captured by that, that's been increasing to such great extent over the last 10, 20 years. But it is, so the answer to your question is there are a bunch of codes that you can put in there that are subjective codes that don't correspond to some conditions that are considered necessarily problematic.
And I bet failed induction is a biggie. I don't remember, but that could be, I mean, these failed inductions might not be failed inductions. They might just be like, you want to have a C-section? Let's just like try an induction real fast first. Yeah.
So another one is something like abnormal fetal heart rate was increasing in prevalence a lot as a diagnosis. So there have been some increases in the prevalence of some diagnoses that are actually plausible, that are related to obesity, that are related to other conditions. Increasing fetal or abnormal fetal heart rate is not one of those conditions that the pediatricians and OBGYNs that we've talked to think could plausibly have increased quite a lot during this period.
Great. So we are running out of time here. I have, of course, lots more questions, but has anybody not been able to ask the question? I see Dennis, you had a couple of questions. Did you have one that hasn't been asked or answered already in chat?
Well, so, I mean, Ka addressed them in chat. Briefly, I was curious, you know, I believe there's a couple of countries, including Brazil, that have very high rates of C-section and induced birth. And I'm just wondering if there's also elevated rates of ASD there. And I think Ka addressed this in the chat. Apparently it's quite difficult to compare across countries.
That's interesting though, because Brazil has like the highest rate. We have a map at the end of our slideshow. Brazil has like the highest rate in the world, I think. So it'd actually be interesting if we could get our hands on some data, even though it's hard to make a comparison.
Cool.
Yeah, rates have been increasing in many countries. I mean, it's not unique to the US.
Right.
So Josh, if you want to copy the chat and send it over to us, we can go through it and answer questions
That would be
we
great.
didn't cover,
Yeah.
and then send it back to you and you can redistribute it, or someone can.
Maria, are you going to act in my stead? Can you?
Sorry, say it again.
Can you act in my stead and send on the chat?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we've actually, I've done a couple blog entries where authors responded, and we just published the chat conversation with the
That's
annotation.
great.
Great. So let me just ask a final question. So any experimental designs that other research teams are doing to try to pin some of these things down? Is anything ethical? Is anything?
No, there was a randomized control trial of just induction, vaginal induction versus waiting. I got a lot of attention. It was called the ARRIVE trial. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine. But it was very low risk mothers, and it just said they just randomly induced vaginal inductions, and the vaginal induction group actually did better than the ones who waited. But it was a group that didn't want to have C-sections. You know, they were not, and doctors were not supposed to perform C-sections unless they had to. And so some of the mothers went post-term, and so that's the only experiment that I know of.
Super. I mean, what initially attracted me to when I first heard the talk was just this huge change in elective deliveries in this country. It's just enormous. It's much bigger than our changes in fertility levels or anything like that. And so today we got a flavor of it, how big the changes are, and then what some of the consequences may be. So really rich area. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to, Dennis, can you repost the Gather Town for anybody who wants to
Sure.
to chat afterwards? This is just informal socializing. You might
Maria
want to
also, oh sorry, Maria also sent it to the talk list. So if you
okay, great.
Because this will evaporate when you log out of Zoom.
Super. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Let's turn off our mutes and give considerable applause here.
Thank you. It's been great.
Great talk, and it was wonderful to have all the co-authors with you too. So thanks so much.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.